So the topic looks like very boring, because I used to speak on this topic many times, but what to do? Again and again, it brought back on the agenda. 3 months ago, 500 students from Columbia University wrote a very powerful letter saying, with their signatures, with their addresses, with their identification, saying that we are Jews, we are Zionists, Zionism is part of Jewish identity, and we demand from the administration, from the government, and from the administration of the university to protect us as Jews and Zionists. So I believe it's a remarkable letter. It's remarkable not only because, well, here are some people from Columbia University, some from others. I visited probably 100 universities in the last 15 years. I was in 5 times I went to America since the 7th of October because of the situation of the universities. And I know what it is, and people from Columbia University also know what it is in today's atmosphere of absolute unprecedented violence and threats, when the best what administration can propose is to students, don't come to the campus, you'll pass your exams by Zoom, we will permit you to study by Zoom. And when the main efforts are done to silence Jewish students, in order they will not create uncomfortable space for oppressed students. So in this situation, to write such a letter is courageous. But what's no less important, I think, that they insist that Zionism is part of Jewish identity. In fact, they resist to this new round of attempts to say that there is no connection. We are against Israel, what it has to do with anti-Semitism. After all, really, from the river to the sea, it's about Israel. Stop genocide is about Israel. What it has to do with anti-Semitism. And there is IRA definition, which has special mentions as 11 examples when anti-Semitism becomes when anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitic, but people say, okay, it's only examples. We can give many more examples. What is the principle? And of course, there are some other definitions. One of them, famous Jerusalem definition of Zionism, Jerusalem Declaration, which make it very simple. They disconnect fully Zionism from anti-Semitism. That's it, simple work. So I'll try briefly to speak about the history of the question. At least as I see, again, here we are a lot of academicians, professors. I'm not a professor. Everything what I'm saying is from my personal experience. So in Soviet Union, on this question, the life was very, very simple and easy. It was clear for everybody that there is absolutely no difference between Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. It was all the same. There are a lot of restrictions for Jews to enter different universities or to have different careers. The moment there is a new complication in relation with Israel, it becomes more difficult. I was the student of one of the most prestigious universities. It was extremely difficult for Jews to get to this university. Next year, it was simply impossible. Why? Because there was a 6-day war, and automatically the Jews who have no idea what Israel is, who have no idea what Zionism is, but only because in their ID is written Jew, automatically there are more restrictions for them. And vice versa, when there is campaign against cosmopolites, because there can be no campaign against Jews, but there was a big campaign against cosmopolites. Those who are not patriotic enough, and that's why they cannot be good Soviet citizens, automatically, next day, there is accusation that they are not loyal because they are American and Israeli agents. And again, these people have no idea what Israel is. They never read any article in Hebrew or in Yiddish, but the moment the authorities want to say something bad about Jews, they say that they are Israel agents. And of course, cartoons, maybe that is the best demonstration of everything. The cartoons against cosmopolites and against Israel are absolutely the same. Old people with long hands and short legs, with a big, big nose. And you can take it exactly from Hitler propaganda or from Soviet propaganda about Israel and about cosmopolites, which meant, of course, Jews. It's absolutely the same cartoons. So for ordinary people, it was clear that that is the same. And the reason, well, later when I became an activist and we spent a lot of time discussing the nature of the regime and how to fight the regime, the reason seemed to be very clear that it's totalitarian regime, dictatorship. Dictatorship needs enemies in order to mobilize their own people permanently in the struggle. They need enemies, external enemies and internal enemies. And there is no better external, internal enemy than Jews and Israel, of course. Especially that it is also built very well on the prejudices of hundreds of years. You understand how deep were these prejudices. And sometimes we forget, we think that these Jewish anti-Semitic prejudices disappear, old anti-Semitic prejudices. My best friend with the time became my best and closest friend in the Soviet Gulag. Christian, activist, young Christian, Orthodox friend who was fighting for independence of the church from the state, and of course he also was in prison. But we spent a lot of time together, but in the very beginning, one of his first questions said, tell me, I always was interested, how it was in the tradition of drinking Christian blood on Pesach. And they said, I was absolutely shocked. And he's intelligent from St. Petersburg. And he said, no, I'm not talking about you. But 300-400 years ago, there was something. It was that's why you're drinking red wine on Pesach. You understand? And it was intelligent, good guy, but he never met and discussed it with Jews. But it's clear, everybody knows about it. So the depth of prejudice was very big. And that's why it is so natural and so easy on these two to put the image of external and internal enemy. That was our theory. And with this, I was released from prison. Thanks God, came to the free world. Now this part of my life is behind us. Now we are building new life. Thanks God, million Jews came to Israel. We have a lot of things to do. And then came the year 2000, Durban Conference, when for the first time United Nations organized a global conference against racism. And the main message, maybe even the only message from this conference, was that Israel is an apartheid state. And how it is, after all, we live, the Arabs are our close, sometimes neighbors, but always partners in practically everything what we are doing. It was before Arab judge sent Israeli president to prison for sexual harassment, but nevertheless, Arabs were in the most important position in the country. How it can be? And then comes one very important intellectual from Europe and says, and I'm the government responsible also for the struggle against antisemitism. And he speaks on the press conference and says, I was in Palestinian refugee camp, that is Auschwitz of today. And I have to say, I was many times in the Palestinian refugee camps. It's a shame that fifth generation of Palestinians lives in refugee camps. We can debate who is guilty and who is more guilty, who is less guilty. But what it has to do with Auschwitz? We saw here a number of specials just now we heard on Auschwitz. And my daughters were in Auschwitz, I was in Auschwitz, everybody was in Auschwitz. What it has to do with the refugee camp? And then cartoon. Now we are in the second Intifada. Cartoon in The Guardian, which becomes the best cartoon of the year in England and then in Europe. Ariel Sharon eating Palestinian kids and blood drops from his mouth. And it reminds me of the question of my good friend Vladimir Porosh, how we dealt with this blood of Christians. And I go to England, meet with this cartoonist and challenge him. That is clear anti-Semitism. He goes, what the hell? Look at my best friends are Jewish. Well, how it can be anti-Semitism? And then I go to United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva, and very great Canadian lawyer movement, she is the chairman. And they say, look, that is the year of Chechnya and Darfur, and of course Uyghurs people in China, and the only question which is on the agenda is the crimes of Israel against Palestinians. And I say, I don't say that it has not to be discussed, but what about all these topics? And she explains me that you're right, but what I can do, there is agreement between Arab countries and between China and between Russia that this question is not, and they have majority, this Darfur and Chechnya and Chinese violation of human rights against Uyghurs will not be brought. And here there is no agreement. There is, okay. That's when I came with my 3D principle, because I said, let's look what are the main means, instruments, principles that anti-Semites were approaching Jews. First of all, demonization. Demonization, we Christ killers and spoilers of the wealth, and all these bad things, as Sartre said in his book, Anti-Semite and Jew, that for anti-Semite, Jew is the closest thing to Satan. And demonization usually it doesn't want to have any proof, any explanation. Simply you take something awful that everybody agrees that is awful, and you say these are the Jews. That's how demonization works. And now look, the same, they say Israel is Auschwitz. There is no way to prove it, because everybody who started taking realities, there is nothing to prove, but that's a great statement. And apartheid. Again, you know, Amnesty International published a few years ago a report about apartheid. And they write there, of course it's not apartheid as we defined it for South Africa. But, and then say, but from our point of view, it's also apartheid. If it is not apartheid, you say, so you can explain exactly what you see and with what you disagree. But the word apartheid is used because that is demonization. You say something awful, you don't need to prove it, you then describe it and say, for me, that is apartheid. For me, that is Auschwitz. More fresh examples of the modern blood libel, of course, deathly or bloody encounter. You know, it's on many campuses. It was that Israeli police is teaching American police how to deal with black people, and that all these awful things they learned it when they were dealing with Palestinians, and then they bring them for special courses in Israel. That's what they study, and on many campuses there was a special week on this deathly encounter and so on. Of course, it's all lie, but Nobody's really proving it. Nobody tries when you say, wait, look, for a moment, yeah, there is agreement about the mutual causes, about anti-terrorist activity, but what has to, doesn't matter. It's, or there was, on one internet, there was said that Israeli troops came to Haiti. You remember there was an earthquake, and we were the first to come, and in America we got a lot of compliments, and so they came there to harvest the organs of the population. Again, absolute lie, no, nothing, but it immediately went on the internet, and then there is a request in German parliament and in British parliament to study this case, and there is nothing to study, but that's typically how demonization works. Now the other tool is double standard. We're speaking about these. Double standard. Well, I have at home the book of laws by Russian, Tsarist Russia, 300 years, laws where there is special clause about Jews. 1,000 laws where Jews are differently paying taxes, living, going to the universities, and so on. Well, in Germany and in Soviet Union, there was no laws, but the practice was exactly like this. Everybody knew the moment it's written in your ID or your parents, Jew, there is different story. And when United Nations is condemning Israel for violation of human rights more than all the dictators in the world together, so even if you really believe that all these condemnations are true, there must be something, some very different standard. You cannot explain how Syria and China and all these awful Iran, all these awful regimes together are condemned less than Israel. So there must be really very different standards. There are many other examples when it's clear that different standards are used. And the third is delegitimization. Jews are illegitimate religion in the first 400 years of Christianity. And it's clear why it was a problem for Christianity when we are replacing these old prejudices, and all our roots are Judaism, and Judaism still continues to exist. And then there was denial of Jews as a race, as a legitimate race. And then there is a special famous article of Stalin, why Jews are not a nation, with a lot of practical consequences for this. And here, we're coming to this denial of Jewish state to exist. What means from the river to the sea? Well, some people say, well, they simply don't know what river and what sea. Here in Oxford, there was an interesting debate, you can see it on YouTube, when one after another was asked, students, but what part of Palestine has to be liberated? And everybody who was asked said all the Palestine, because Israel is a colonial project. And one said, look, I read Ben-Gurion, I read Balfour, I tell you, Israel is a colonial project. And colonial projects, because of social justice, has no right to exist. So if you look, it's the same logic why Judaism cannot exist after Christianity appeared. No, it was 1,500 years ago. So these are the approaches of anti-Semitism towards Jews for 1,000 years. And in the last 50, 60 years, they use the approach, the same tools are used against Jewish state. And what I was saying that all the credit, I was doing it many times with my students. You have criticism about Israel, try to express it without 3Ds. And you know, everybody can do it. Instead of saying that Israel has genocide against Palestinians, because it's impossible. You take definition of genocide, you cannot prove it. You can say that as a result of disproportional response of Israel, many innocent people were killed. And then we can start discussing with you, debating whether it is proportional to what did America in Iraq or disproportional and so on. But these are the facts. You agree or don't agree. It's not demonization. It's simply discussion of the facts. When you're saying simply that Israel is an apartheid state or it's genocide, that's impossible. So what I'm saying, if person cannot express their criticism without delegitimizing Israel, or without demonizing Israel, or without using double standard, that's anti-Semites. And we should not be embarrassed or shy to accuse International Human Rights Court or Amnesty International in anti-Semitism if they are using these methods. Not speaking about, of course, students in the campuses. And now I want to say why 3Ds, why I choose 3Ds. Because if you'll go to 3D film and will watch this film without 3D spectacles, you will not understand anything. It's absolute tohu-bohu, how you say in English, tohu-bohu, yeah. Chaos, absolute chaos. And then you put the 3D spectacles, and oh, that is a horse, that's a person, that's a couple, and you understand what's happening. So put these 3Ds on critics of Israel, and you'll find out who is right, who is wrong, but what's more important, who is anti-Semite. And if you see that they are anti-Semites, let's call them anti-Semites. That's all. No. It's academical thing. So questions, answers, proposals, ideas.
In a country where the government is supporting Hamas, how can I teach and research on the contemporary anti-Semitism in China?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, from my experience, I can say, and I'm sorry to say it, that if you are not ready to go to prison, you should not better teach. No, you should not be ready to teach against the positions of the government. But if you really want to fight for tikkun olam, for real justice, yeah, it's not tikkun olam which is used for, but for real justice, yeah, you should make sure that while you're speaking, you have attention of the world, you have attention of all those. I was like spokesman. It's not spokesman in this meaning, but you have to build relations with different people in the world who are interested in this topic and whose position can be of some importance for Chinese government, and make sure that when you're teaching this, they know about it. Still, you are not protected. You can't be arrested, but it's, if you're ready, it's not so awful.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I've really appreciated your 3Ds for a very long time.
Yeah.
You've just added a fourth D, and that's denial. And I was wondering if you could just spend a little bit of time, aside from your statement about the denial of Jews as a nation, what brings you to that now in particular? And if you could just elaborate on
No, well, first of all, it's not fourth. We don't have 4D spectacles, so we can get. But it's delegitimization. Delegitimization. That's also. So your 4D goes well with my 3D. So let's agree not to increase it, because then we don't have such a great image. Now about why today? Because today, in this last set of campaign, the slogan "From the river to the sea" went out from the usage by Palestinian activists who were shouting it, that by blood and whatever we will liberate Palestine, and that from the river to the sea it will be. So it was really almost local slogan. Now it's the leading march slogan of the students on more than 100 universities, and those who say, but they don't know what is which sea and which river they say. frankly, does matter for them, because that is the beginning of liberation. That's what was said after 7th of October. That's how liberation looks. And that's the beginning of it. And that's why it doesn't matter from what sea, every sea and every river in the world has to be liberated. And now, and specifically, and that was very powerful in this YouTube from Oxford, but it's in many other places. Specifically, as a result of this postmodern, post-colonial theory, colonialism, which is so deeply present in our civilization, that's I'm quoting them, you see, but physically there is, if you don't go to the language, if you don't go to literature, to different institutions, but there is a lot of colonialism, and that's the state of Israel. And that's why it should not exist in our social justice world, and in our critical series of colonialism. It should not exist. It's something which came very strong, I would say, after this. Theoretically, it existed, but so powerfully in the minds of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of students in American universities, it came here. And that's, I'm saying, it's absolute anti-Semitic, because it's denial of Jewish state to exist is exactly in the most hard times of the persecution of Jews by Christianity, in the most dark times, there was denial of Judaism to exist.
Thank you so much.
My question to you is that, with you having discussed the 3Ds for quite some time, if I were sitting here last year, what would be different now in your approach in thinking about October 7? And I'm asking this question in the context of some of my work in thinking about teaching on the legacy of Holocaust in medicine and its contemporary relevance, and fighting against what I see as what I call a homogenization of the Holocaust now, where it's kind of losing a distinctive Jewish lens in some ways. It's become, I'm on a Lancet Commission for that, but it's not the Lancet Commission on Human Rights, although we care about human rights. It's the Lancet Commission on Medicine during the Holocaust. And when we are now having an inversion of that, when we're trying to give our seminars on how we're becoming the Nazis, we're dehumanizing the Palestinians, let's learn the lessons of the Holocaust today, it's putting us in ridiculous, absurd situations. So I wanted to sort of get from you, what do you see as different now in how to go somewhere with this?
Yeah, no, it's such a big question, and I don't want to take time from my other colleagues, but I'll tell you what I think, what was especially clear to me, became new. Well, intuitively, not only intuitively, I felt for years that progressivism and liberalism are not only are not twins, but are enemies. But it was very difficult to convince people who believe in Tikkun Olam that progressives are not people who believe in human rights. What became this meeting between the leaders of social justice extremists, I would say, or the meeting between Ruth Butler and the other leaders of progressivism, and the most primitive criminals of Hamas, who were giving instructions not only to rape, but put it on the tape in order to frighten all the Israelis. And then Ruth Butler explains that it's not against Jews, it's against settlers. And that for me is such a powerful meeting between the world of communism in which I was grown, and when the first communists were explaining that pogroms which brought most of your grandfathers here, that they were not against Jews, they were against capitalists, because that was the beginning of Marxism in Russia. And so these most primitive forms of Jew hatred of Hamas are meeting with the most powerful leaders or ideologies of the heroes of progressive movement, the leading feminists and so on. The fact that in such a primitive way it is meeting, I think it's like eye-opening. Who needs today all these 3Ds? It's simply there. It's openly. So from my point, it's awful what happened, but it has finally to explain us what a dangerous meeting between extremists. I wouldn't say it on the right, because what are the Islamists? But okay, let's call them extremists on the right and extremists on the left are meeting and agreeing on one thing. They're agreeing that Jews should not exist in this world. Okay?
So, thank you very much.
Okay.
I just want to say before I begin, and thanks obviously to Sima and Natan, I have to say and share something very personal. To my right is one of my childhood leaders and heroes. So many of you may not know, but in my home, I always tell Natan, there was a very big book. It was called the Sharansky case. And the Sharansky case is what very small children sat on as boosters at our kitchen table, including my own sisters, because they were much younger than I. And that is because Avital and Natan were dear friends before they were actually even sort of really known to my parents. Avital was a good friend of my mother's, and Natan was my father's case and cause. Natan Sharansky and Soviet Jewry for us was the struggle, the human rights struggle of our time. And I share that with you.
Hold the 5 minutes left for your lecture.
That's it. That's all I want to talk about. I share that with you because it informs a lot of what I will share in terms of my analysis. I share that with you because it adds a perspective that allows me to thank Natan for what is perhaps the most important contribution in identifying and combating anti-Semitism comprehensively, which is the 3Ds. No joke aside, not 3D glasses, but the 3Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards are possibly the most important understanding for the current identification and combating of anti-Semitism, and I will say that has allowed anti-Semitism, as Professor Robert Richter called it, the oldest hatred in the world, to mutate over thousands of years. And that's where I will begin my talk from a bit of a different perspective and maybe a different analysis than Sima's before, because the understanding that what it is that we have to watch for is those 3Ds that have enabled anti-Semitism to mutate over thousands of years. And the late Rabbi Sachs explained that anti-Semitism, a virus, the way that it mutates, like all viruses do, is by latching onto the guiding social construct of the time: religion, science, and the secular religion of our time's human rights, which is what renders this moment in time, and I do believe it's an existential moment, a never again is now moment, an existential moment not just for the nation state of the Jewish people, to which, in Ben Gurion ideology, we returned after thousands of years of persecution and exile, to an ancestral homeland that after thousands of years we return to. That's just Israel's Declaration of Independence, committed to equality 76 years ago. Not just that, and not just Jews around the world who are attacked, as we speak, in what is a tsunami of anti-Semitism, not a gradual rise. And Sima did note that there have always been, intersecting with COVID and other operations, but we are witnessing a tsunami of anti-Semitism around the world. And I will say an anti-Semitism that is not just targeting Jews. It gives us a great looking glass to understanding that it's targeting Zionists, or actually anyone who believes in the right of the state of Israel to exist, as we saw only yesterday in an attack on Majd al-Shams. And that understanding is a critical moment that gives us the lens into understanding the existential nature of this moment. And the reason that it is existential is that the mechanism that was used to enable this demonization, delegitimization, and double standard that just morphed from the 3Ds that bar the individual Jew from an equal place in society to the 3Ds, demonization, delegitimization, and double standards that bar the Jewish nation state, the proverbial Jew among the nations, if you will, the state that was intended to be the state of the Jews, but instead has become the Jew among the states, the understanding that that was enabled by the systematic co-opting and weaponization of the international law institutions and the human rights infrastructure created, mandated, entrusted in the aftermath of the Holocaust to ensure never again. That is what makes this a never again is that now moment, not just for the state of Israel, not just for Jews around the world, but in fact for the entire coal mine. While we may be the bloody canary in the coal mine again, this is symptomatic of indicative of the entire coal mine collapsing again. And that is the moment in which we meet. So I'm sorry that if you hear the urgency in my voice, it may mean not that I don't have hope. I have a great deal of hope. And to already tell Natan, the last time, about 2,500 years ago, that in ancient Persia there was an intent to commit genocide of the Jewish people, I know precisely what it is that we had to do as a people. Because Mordechai said to Esther then, if you will be silent now, salvation will come to the Jewish people, and you and your father's home will be destroyed, and who knows if it's not for this moment that you have arrived. And that's the moment that we're in. So ultimately, yes, Jewish history gives us a looking glass to understanding how anti-Semitism or this hatred has mutated over time. But the understanding that we meet here today at ISGAP, and this is perhaps where I differ in my analysis from where I begin than Seema, the understanding that we arrived at this moment after 76 years in which when that prototypical indigenous people, and by the way, that's why we're not white. We're not white because it's not our story. It's literally not the story of the Jewish people. It's an application of a false construct on our story. Prototypical indigenous, because we speak the same language, Hebrew, and we read the same book that was desecrated on the massacre of Simchat Torah, the Bible, and we traverse the same land, Israel, where we've always remained, and we practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's literally what indigeneity means. And the understanding that with the return of that prototypical indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution, including the Holocaust, not because of the Holocaust, again, the Declaration of Independence, the understanding that a series of conventional wars intended openly to destroy the state of Israel, to annihilate the state of Israel, and failing to do so from 1948 to 1973, what I call an unconventional war for public opinion is launched. And it is launched with what Natan can teach us about, the Zionism is Racism UN resolution. Soviet propaganda, 1975 in the UN, alive and well on 2024 university campuses in the name of progress. Zionism is Racism, blood libel number 1. Blood libel number 2, the 2001 Conference Against Racism, that turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest. And we have to be very open about the fact that we all know that for the 23 years since, there have been Israel apartheid weeks on every single campus. It didn't happen overnight that Orwellian blood libel was spread. Zionism is Racism, yes, UN resolution. Then 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, every single campus has an Israel apartheid week. Every single year. 23 years of graduates now know that Zionists are racist, because Zionism is racism, and Israel is an apartheid state. And if I may, 2023, post-10/7, and I call it 10/7 because like 9/11, it was the attack of barbarism on civilization. That is the way it had to go down in the history books. But it isn't the way it went down in the history books. On 10/8, there were already student newspapers publishing articles about Israel committing genocide before we even understood the full disaster that had befallen the Jewish people and all those that were in the way of the 3,000 plus barbaric savages that infiltrated Israel on 10/7. On 10/8, there were already demonstrations. When I was on my first emergency trip to George Washington University, and I've met with many university presidents since 10/7, Glory to our martyrs and from the river to the sea was projected on the George Washington University Library. Hamas charter. Hamas is a genocidal terror organization. The understanding that this happened as a response to 10/7, that there was not the acknowledgement that, like 9/11, this was the attack of barbarism on civilization fueled by anti-Semitism, but that in fact the very same anti-Semitism fueled the responses to 10/7, responses of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew, responses of denial, even while those barbaric savages were live streaming what they perpetrated, responses of justification. Just like Natan said with Judith Butler, who I still studied in law school as radical feminist, radical, yes, but feminist, explained that rape is armed resistance. And response of attacking Jews / Zionists / anyone who believes in Israel's right to exist all over the world, barring them from entering synagogues. Paul Kessler, say his name, killed in a demonstration in LA holding an Israeli flag. We don't even remember. Holocaust museums utilized Anne Frank being appropriated and weaponized to allege that the state of Israel is perpetrating none other than what I referred to before, the most Orwellian inversion to fact and of law in 2023. So Zionism is racism and Israel is an apartheid state. And when we reach 2023 and the response to the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust is not just the silence and the denial and the justification, but the attack of Jews, accusing the Jewish nation state, come full circle, of none other than the crime of genocide, a word that my father taught me that we should shudder when we utter. Genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, a survivor of Auschwitz whose entire family was annihilated, alongside crimes against humanity coined by Lauterbach, so that we could describe the atrocities of the Holocaust, too terrible to imagine but not too terrible to have happened. Genocide itself, appropriated and weaponized to charge the state of Israel by none other than South Africa, in none other than the International Court of Justice, of the crime of genocide, even as the Jew among the nations defends itself from openly declared intent to commit genocide, literally in the Hamas charter. But one proxy of that same Islamic regime in Iran, alongside the Houthis, alongside Hezbollah, all openly declaring their intent to annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews. So when we talk about what this moment represents as a national security threat to other countries, for me it comes from the understanding that it's the very international institutions, the UN, the ICJ, the ICC, and the entire foundational principles created, entrusted, so that never again to anybody, if those have been co-opted and weaponized to demonize the state of Israel, such a demon that in every annual gathering of the Human Rights Council at the UN, it is, as Natan said, charged with more human rights violations than all countries in the world, China and Iran and Venezuela and all of them together, the state of Israel year after year, delegitimized as it has no right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, and apply double standards to. And here, I would like to actually stress the double standard piece. Maybe it's the lawyer in me, and maybe it's because of my father's teaching. But any principle, any rule that is applied selectively is not worth the paper it is written on. We have to understand the implication of double standards, not just for Jews or their nation state, or Zionists, because anti-Zionism is the new strain of anti-Semitism. So it matters not that the majority of Jews in the world are Zionists. Yes, indeed, it targets all of them. But any self-defined Zionist is actually attacked by this anti-Semitism, this strain of anti-Zionism that demonizes and delegitimizes, applies double standards to Israel. But the understanding that those rules will cease to exist for anybody. And now we zoom out to geopolitics, and someone asked before, so who's they? Well, if we are not watching the writing on the wall and not understanding this moment as we would have and should have pre-World War II, in the understanding that there is a very real axis of evil, Iran and Putin's Russia and China, that became a utilitarian anti-Semitic peddling state, right? Actually, anecdotally, weeks after 10/7 and the responses to 10/7 of silence and denial and justification and attack of Jews, I don't know if you know, but on TikTok, China disseminated bin Laden's letter to America. We saw just 2 weeks ago China hosting a unity conference, a meeting of the minds between Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, and let's say it very openly, a Palestinian Authority leadership that denies the Holocaust, denies 10/7, peddles anti-Semitism, including in UNRWA textbooks funded by majority of countries that would never allow to teach those textbooks in their countries, Canada and the United States and France and Germany, and of course pays to slay Jews, a unity that is united by anti-Semitism as defined by IRA. And I want to say the importance of IRA for a moment, and actually, maybe Natan doesn't even know yet, but I finally got 2 Israeli universities to adopt IRA last week. Ben Gurion University and Haifa were the first 2 Israeli universities to adopt IRA. The importance of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, began in the aftermath, or lead up actually, to Durban and in the aftermath of Durban. We have to understand that who convened at Durban and witnessed their entire life's work being co-opted and weaponized were human rights experts. Understanding that their entire life's work that enabled the release of Soviet Jewry was co-opted and weaponized so that it would be able to protect nobody. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance not only convened experts from around the world, but created a long democratic process in the aftermath of which we have a comprehensive definition, including the 11 examples. The importance of a comprehensive definition when we keep in mind that, as the late Rabbi Sachs defined anti-Semitism as a shape-shifting or ever-mutating virus, when we keep that in mind, we understand that a virus mutates. And after COVID, we're all viral experts. It doesn't help if we only are able to identify and inoculate our spaces and places for COVID-19 when Omicron comes around. So it is with anti-Semitism. The 11 examples that are listed as an integral part of IRA are critical if we are to comprehensively identify and combat an ever-mutating virus, including all of its strains. And by the way, when I tell people it's a working definition, being adopted by more than 42 countries, more than 1,200 entities, it's a very important work. And every university president I meet with, and mayor I meet with, and police chief I meet with, it is a resource. It's an educational resource. How are you going to identify something if you don't define it? And how are you going to combat something if you can't identify it? Well, that's what IRA intended to be. And we should know that there is a huge pushback on IRA, against IRA, to dismantle IRA. Some of you may be familiar with a new term, APR, anti-Palestinian racism. Anti-Palestinian racism will basically say, if you believe in the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, that is anti-Palestinian racism. And DEI policies already, and school boards already, certainly in Canada, have added APR to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate. So the understanding that IRA is going to be dismantled from within leaves me with a very clear gratitude, not only for identifying the 3Ds as the mechanism that enables the mutation of anti-Semitism, but this is why that mechanism is so important to others. The understanding that the genocide in Rwanda didn't happen overnight. The genocide in Serbia didn't happen overnight. The genocide happening in Sudan right now didn't happen overnight. Those 3Ds are the mechanism that actually enable genocide. The dehumanization, Kfir Bibas, now over a year old, more than half his life spent in the dungeons of Hamas, you can rip down his poster because that's not a human baby. And the delegitimization, even if it is a human baby, he has no right to exist. He's just an Israeli soldier, a settler, mind you, because we're all settlers. And 10/7 made that very clear. I know, because it took 5 weeks to identify the remains of 72-year-old Canadian-Israeli peace activist Vivian Silver. And she totally dedicated her life to peace. It mattered not where she lived. That's not what 10/7 was about. And of course, the double standard. That double standard that says Maybe other babies have a right to live, but that baby has no right to live. And so we have come to this moment in time where the understanding that the very co-opting and weaponization of that international rules-based order and its institutions, of the human rights infrastructure, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Natan mentioned some of them. The understanding that Bob Bernstein in the early 90s published an article in the New York Times recognizing that human rights, the understanding that they were lost in the Middle East, I believe that's what he called what had happened then. The understanding that if they were going to get lost in the Middle East, embroiled in the systematic demonization, delegitimization, double standards against the Jew among the nations, then those human rights would not be able to protect anyone. And that's the moment of time that we meet. It is an existential moment. And like Natan, I am filled with hope, but in the sense of hope that, as the late Rabbi Sachs, I always quote, taught us, is not optimism. It's not the belief that everything will be okay. It's not windfall. It's the belief that together we can make it okay. It's a very active virtue that takes a great deal of courage. And when I meet with a room full of academics, students, professors, administrators, the understanding that what has happened in the academic spaces, because I spoke about the international institutions, but the academic spaces over time, and actually my own doctoral research about the regulation of speech of university campuses, is not something that leaves us in great anticipation of hope if we don't fight for what has happened in academic spaces. The question to be asking university presidents and professors and administrators is, what is the role of a university? Is it to teach people how to think? Or is it to teach people what to think, which is a very scary prospect. And somebody asked before about medicine, about the medical field, and I want to share with you that for me, the fact that we knew to identify what had happened in humanities and in social sciences in universities was troubling enough. I do believe we've entered the final frontier of universities, and that is the medical schools, the exact sciences, the understanding that human or humanity and the pursuit of knowledge and the endorsement of science of this anti-Semitism is perhaps the most dangerous moment within academic circles as well. And we are there. We are there in which not just paramedical fields and certainly psychologist unions that you have to belong to if you want to be insured are pushing out their Zionist members, and the APA, and the very many sort of organized professional sort of orders. But literally within medical schools, we see courses on the anatomy of occupation. The anatomy of occupation that'll call out what it is that the state of Israel has done to the Palestinians. And that is a moment of reckoning, as I said, to university spaces, because science is critical to the advance of humanity. And finally, and I just want to close with this because I won't have time to dwell on it too much, but I want to remind us that in the intersection of the responses to 10/7 and actually to the massacre yesterday in Majd al-Shams, of silence and denial and justification and attack of Jews around the world in the response to 10/7. What we saw across international institutions, I mentioned some of them, across university spaces, including encampments, and I want to make something really clear about those encampments. Very often, they're not at all speech. They're conduct. They're intimidation, they're bullying, they're harassment, and those universities have policies in order to address intimidation and bullying and harassment. They're just not implementing their policies. And remember what we said about double standards undermining the entire principle or rule. But there is a third sort of front, if you will, and that is the fact that we live in a social media era. And we didn't touch it at all, but the understanding that the ability to spread conspiracy myths, and that's what anti-Semitism is. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it, right? It's a conspiracy myth. It's why the IRA definition is so important. The understanding that we live at a time where there is a super spreader of conspiracy myths, on social media, on digital platforms, and the understanding that by definition, we live at a time where polarization and fragmentization are being emulated. What happens online doesn't remain online. We know that, not just from the Tree of Life synagogue and for so many other attacks. We understand that what happens online absolutely impacts the real world. And you have this sort of concentric circle of these war fronts, if you will, feeding off one another. The international institutions, ICC, ICJ, university spaces, and social media spaces. And there is this constant dialogue amongst those spaces, between those spaces. And that means that everyone in this room, all academics, students, professors, administrators, that actually are at the forefront of the way that humanity, I'll say, consumes information. How do we teach people how to consume information? It's the role of universities to consume information, to ask questions, to think critically. Well, the way that humanity consumes information has changed radically, and the way that we consume the information has not changed radically. And that is the moment that we meet at, and I do know that most of you here follow, including the very bad agents, are using social media spaces, not just university spaces, with billions of dollars being funneled through them. And not just the international institutions, in which, of course, Israel is outnumbered, and of course the likelihood of being voted when, Iran is the president of the UN Disarmament Commission. Yeah. Of course, then there are real ridiculous sort of Orwellian manifestations of that. But also in the social media spaces, the understanding that very negative entities, who's they? Countries, Iran, Russia, China, can use social media spaces to do precisely what I believe anti-Semitism is just the predictor of. I don't think that they just were targeting Jews. I actually think that the they is those that actually seek the demise of democracy, of civilization as we know it, the understanding that identifying the strengths of democracies, free speech, and using them as weaknesses, anti-Semitism just predicts that in all of those spaces and places. It's not just about anti-Semitism, including in this current mutated mainstream strain of anti-Zionism. It is about what anti-Semitism predicts, which is actually, from my perspective, the existential sort of moment that we are in that does threaten not just the state of Israel, but democracy or societies that cherish life and liberty. Thank you. Oh, I want to say one hopeful thing to the 3Ds, because I actually wrote this down for myself not to forget. The importance of the 3Ds make me realize something very clear, actually, not just the importance of using, something that's memorable, but what I would call the 3 Rs, actually, because I spoke a lot about the co-opting and weaponization, including of our own history, of our own understanding of who we are, our identity as Zionists, as an indigenous people. So remembering the 3 Rs, remember who we are as a people, who the Jewish people is, whether you're a Jew or not. We have an identity, we have a history, and actually, Judaism and Jews did not begin in Germany, and obviously anti-Semitism didn't die in Auschwitz. We got that. But remembering our history is the first step to being able to address the challenge that we face. Reclaiming, and it's not just reclaiming our identity as an indigenous people or Zionists. I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh. It's integral to who I am. It's integral to my identity. But also remembering and reclaiming what it is that are the foundational principles of each of our societies, and of course of international law, and of course of democracies. And finally, renewing the covenant, not only of our people amongst ourselves and to the state of Israel to which we return, but renewing the covenant amongst societies in which the international law institutions were intended to regulate and to ensure the continued sort of coexistence. So thanks, and the 3 Rs are my response in 3Ds. Gives me hope.